The day my sister introduced me to her husband's colleagues as our family's little charity case, I smiled and shook every hand in that room. I was 41 years old. I had 3 patents pending, a corner office on the 32nd floor of a building I helped design, and a business card that made grown men straighten their ties when they read it. But I smiled. That's what I always did. I've been thinking about that moment a lot lately, about why I smiled instead of said something. About the 12 years between when I first started biting my tongue and the afternoon I finally stopped. I'm not proud of all of it, but I'm going to tell you the whole thing anyway, because I think some of you already know exactly what I'm describing, and I think you deserve to hear that it ends. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario. My parents weren't cruel people, I want to be clear about that. My mother worked at the hospital reception desk for 26 years, and my father drove long-haul transport until his knees gave out. They loved us the way tired people love things. Intermittently, practically, without much decoration. My older sister Deirdre was the family's centerpiece. She was loud and pretty and charming in the way that small-town girls sometimes are, the kind of person who walks into a room and immediately knows which conversation to join. I was quieter. I liked drafting blueprints on graph paper when I was 9. I liked figuring out why certain buildings stood up and others fell down. I was, in the language of my household, the one who always has her nose in something. Nobody thought that was a compliment. When I was accepted into the architecture program at Waterloo, my mother's response was, "Well, that's far." Deirdre was getting married that same summer to a man named Bryce, who sold commercial real estate and wore a lot of product in his hair. The family's entire emotional bandwidth was consumed by the wedding. I packed my own boxes and took the Greyhound. I won't bore you with the university years because honestly, they were the best years of my life up to that point, and I don't want to rush through them. I'll just say, I found my people. I found professors who got excited about the same things I got excited about. I found work-study placements that turned into references, that turned into a junior position at a firm in Toronto before I even convocated. I was good at this. I knew I was good at this, in the way that you know something in your chest before your brain has the language for it. What I didn't find for a long time was a reason to go home very often. My parents' house in Sudbury felt smaller every time I went back. Not physically, it was the same bungalow with the same rust stain on the garage door, but smaller in the way that spaces shrink when you've outgrown the version of yourself who used to fit inside them. Deirdre and Bryce lived 20 minutes away and came for dinner every Sunday. I came for Christmas and long weekends when I could, which averaged out to maybe 4 or 5 times a year. Every visit, I noticed the same thing. My life existed in that house as a vague abstraction. She's doing something with buildings in Toronto. That was the full extent of it. Nobody asked follow-up questions. I told myself it didn't bother me. I was a grown woman with work to do. The financial requests started small, the way these things always do. My father needed a new alternator. My mother's dental work wasn't covered. Deirdre and Bryce were having a rough quarter. Would I be able to help out, just this once, just until things settled? I helped out. Of course I helped out. I was making real money by then, and they were my family. The first time felt generous, the second time felt like loyalty. By the 5th or 6th time, it had stopped feeling like anything because it had become the baseline. There was always a reason. There was always just until. Over 11 years, I calculated it once, sitting on my apartment floor with a glass of wine and my banking app open, somewhere north of $320,000. Mostly in smaller amounts, $2,000 here, $8,000 there, one absolutely staggering $15,000 when Deirdre and Bryce needed to save the house from a situation I was never given full details about. I never asked for it back. I want to be honest about that. I never once said, here's a loan agreement, and I never once said, when are you paying this back? That's not on them, that's on me. But I also think I believed, on some level, that the money was buying me something. Belonging. Inclusion. The feeling of being seen as part of the family rather than the weird satellite orbiting it from 4 hours south. It wasn't buying me any of those things. I got promoted to associate principal at the firm when I was 34. It wasn't announced in Sudbury. I got my first significant project lead, a mixed-use community center in Brampton, which won a regional design award, and my mother said, "Oh, an award. That's nice." I became a full principal partner at 39. That one I actually brought up over dinner, because I'd been working toward it for a decade, and I wanted, just once, to have someone in my family acknowledge that what I was doing was real and significant and hard-won. Bryce said, "So what does that mean practically? Like, do you get a bigger office?" I said yes. I got a bigger office. Deirdre changed the subject to their renovation. The thing I've come to understand, years later with the help of a very good therapist named Dr. Kehoe, is that I'd built a story around my invisibility. I told myself that if I was just useful enough, present enough, financially available enough, eventually they would turn toward me and actually see me. It's not a logical strategy. I have a master's degree. I have designed structures that house hundreds of people safely every single day. I understand load-bearing systems and stress tolerance and where things break. I did not apply any of this knowledge to my own family dynamics until I was well into my 40s, and even then, I needed help. The afternoon that changed things was in September 2 years ago. Deirdre and Bryce were at a fundraiser gala at the Fairmont Royal York in Toronto, one of those glossy charity events where the tickets are $800 and the wine is poured by people in white gloves. It was for a hospital foundation that Bryce had gotten involved with through a client. Deirdre had called me 3 weeks earlier and asked if I was coming, which I took to mean I was invited, so I showed up in a cocktail dress at 7:15. I want to stop here and explain something about that evening's context, because it's important. The week prior, I had been in Vancouver presenting at a national conference on sustainable urban development. I'd been asked to keynote, asked specifically by name, because a colleague who'd seen my work recommended me. I don't say this to brag. I say it because my name was on the conference materials, my name was in the program, and there were people in that Fairmont ballroom that night who had been in that Vancouver audience 7 days earlier. I did not know this when I walked in. I found Deirdre near the bar. She was with Bryce and 3 of his colleagues and their wives, and when she saw me approaching, something crossed her face that I can only describe as mild inconvenience. The way you look when someone arrives slightly earlier than you were expecting them. "Oh, you made it," she said. She turned to the group. "This is my younger sister. She's in Toronto." That was the full introduction. "I'm in Toronto." One of the men, gray-haired, deep-tan, the kind of man who golfs seriously, extended his hand. "And what do you do in Toronto?" Before I could answer, Deirdre said, "She works at an architecture firm." Not, "She's a partner." Not, "She leads projects." "She works at a firm." Like I was someone who fetched coffee and fixed the printer. I shook the man's hand and said, "I'm a principal partner, actually. Structural and civic design." He nodded politely in the way that people nod when information passes through them without leaving any impression. The evening wore on. I stood on the edge of conversations. I accepted a glass of wine from a passing tray. I watched Deirdre hold court with the ease of someone who has never once doubted her right to take up space, and I felt that familiar heaviness settle over me, the one I'd been carrying since I was 9 years old on the couch with my graph paper while everyone else watched television. And then the man with the gray hair and the golf tan came back. He wasn't alone this time. He had a woman with him, 50s, elegant, wearing a name badge that indicated she was on the gala organizing committee. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, "but I had to ask, are you Cecily Drummond? The architect?" I said yes. His face did something remarkable. It rearranged itself entirely. "We were just talking about Brampton Community Center," the woman said. "And Kenneth here mentioned your name and I said, that couldn't possibly be." She stopped herself. "You keynoted in Vancouver last week." I watched the whole session. The section on passive thermal design in northern climates. I've been sharing that talk with everyone on our board. I told her I was glad it was useful. "Useful," she repeated and laughed. "It was extraordinary. We're actually trying to get your firm involved in the new wing we're planning for this foundation." She gestured at the room around her, meaning the gala, the organization, the whole event. "Our executive director has been trying to reach your firm for weeks. And here is the part that I think about most." Deirdre was standing 3 feet to my left. She had heard all of this. She had watched a woman from a hospital foundation's board of directors tell me that she'd been trying to get my firm involved in a major project. She had watched the gray-haired man shake my hand a second time, differently than the first, the way people shake hands when they understand who they're actually talking to, and she said nothing. She took a sip of her champagne and looked at the room. It was such a small, quiet thing. No explosion, no confrontation. Just nothing. Just the same elegant blankness she'd always offered me. I excused myself a few minutes later. I found the washroom and stood at the sink with the cold water running over my wrists, the way you do when you need your nervous system to calm down. And I looked at myself in the mirror and I thought, when is this enough? Not why does she do this? I'd spent years on that question and it had given me nothing useful. The useful question was, when is this enough for me? Dr. Kehoe had been asking me a version of this question for about 8 months at that point. She hadn't pushed me toward any particular answer, but she'd helped me understand that the money I kept sending home wasn't generosity anymore. It had become proof to myself that I mattered to them, proof that I was worth including, proof that they needed me even if they couldn't quite bring themselves to see me. She called it the transaction I'd been making with myself, and she asked me what I actually wanted to get out of it. What I wanted was for my sister to introduce me properly at a gala, which is not a thing you can buy. I took my wrists out from under the cold water. I dried my hands. I walked back out into that ballroom, and I found the woman from the organizing committee, and I gave her my Reels business card, the one with the partner designation and my direct line, and I told her to have your executive director call me on Monday. She said she would. She did. That project is now in the design phase, and it's some of the most interesting work I've done in years. The foundation paid our standard rate and never once asked for a discount. That part I didn't tell Deirdre about. I didn't tell anyone in my family. Some things don't need to be announced. What I did do, about 6 weeks after that gala, was stop sending money. I didn't do it dramatically. There was no speech. My mother called in early November with the usual opening, "I hate to ask, but," and I said calmly that I wasn't in a position to help right now. She paused. She said, "You're not in a position?" The quotation marks were audible. I said, "No, not right now." She said she'd figure something out. I said I knew she would. Deirdre called 2 days later. She said my mother was stressed and I knew the situation and why was I being difficult. I said I wasn't being difficult. She said it didn't seem like me. I said I thought maybe it was exactly like me, and she just hadn't been paying close enough attention. That was a longer conversation than I'm summarizing here. It didn't go well, in the way that honest conversations often don't go well when they're the first ones. There was some crying, hers and some elevated voices, also mostly hers. And at one point she said, "You've changed," which I've decided to take as a compliment. My mother didn't call for almost 3 months after that. When she finally did, in February, she didn't mention money. We talked for 22 minutes about her garden planning and a documentary she'd watched and whether I was eating enough. It was the most normal conversation we'd had in years. I don't know if it will last. I'm not counting on it. But I noticed it. There is something I want to say to anyone who is currently in the version of this story that I was in 7 or 8 years ago. The part where you keep finding reasons why this time will be different, why this particular transfer will make them finally understand what you mean to them. It won't. I'm sorry, but it won't. Not because your family is irredeemable, I can't speak to that, but because money doesn't translate into love any more than silence translates into peace. I thought I was keeping the family together. What I was actually doing was keeping a version of myself in place that was safe for everyone else. Small enough to fit next to Deirdre's story, useful enough to justify the phone call, present enough to finance the gaps. I was 41 years old before someone in a crowded room recognized my name and my work, and in that moment, I saw my sister's face and understood something I hadn't had words for before. She had always known I was capable. She had always known, in the way that siblings know each other's depths even when they refuse to sound them. The invisibility wasn't ignorance. It was a choice, and I had participated in it. That was harder to sit with than the anger would have been. Anger is clean. This was complicated and embarrassing and required me to look at myself clearly, which is the most difficult thing Dr. Kehoe has ever asked me to do. But here's the thing about looking at yourself clearly. Once you do it, you can't really undo it. You see what's there, and then you have to decide what to build with it. I spent 22 years designing structures that people walk through without thinking. Safe, sound, well-considered. That's the work. The building doesn't need you to notice it. It just needs to hold. I think I spent a lot of years trying to be that for my family. The structure they lived inside without noticing. And I was good at it. I was very good at it. I kept that whole architecture standing for a long time. But I'm not a building. I'm a person. And I have spent enough of my life being load-bearing for people who never once looked up at the ceiling to wonder how it stayed in place. I'm in a good place now. Not perfect. I don't think my relationship with Deirdre will ever be uncomplicated, and I've made a kind of peace with that. My mother and I are finding something slowly with more silence than warmth but also more honesty than we've had since I was a kid on the couch with my graph paper. It's something. I'll take something. My practice is doing extraordinary work. The project with the foundation is the kind of thing I'll point to for the rest of my career. I sleep well. I have a small apartment in the annex that I've done up exactly the way I want it, no compromises. And when I stand at my kitchen window in the morning with my coffee, I sometimes think about that 9-year-old in Sudbury who loved figuring out why things held together, and I think she did okay. She got out. She built something real. That's what I wanted to leave you with. Not the gala moment, not the name recognition, not the look on the gray-haired man's face when he realized who he was talking to. Though I won't lie, that particular memory does make me feel something rather satisfying when it surfaces. But what I actually want you to take from all of this is simpler. You don't have to earn your place in your own family. You never did. And if you've been spending years and money and silence trying to prove that you belong, I want you to know that the proof has always been a bad investment. It never pays out the way you're hoping. The only thing I've ever built that actually held was the thing I built for myself. Everything else was just waiting for walls that were never going to come.